start with our friends over in the ACC. So Brad Crawford put together this piece where he was talking about 9 different teams in the ACC and where he predicts they go. Now, what the title didn't tell you is that 3 teams he put either in the same conference or just put TBD, which I was like, okay, that's not really a prediction, but sure. He talks about it in the Duke prediction. He talks about how he thinks Duke will actually stay in the ACC, but they are more of an SEC lean rather than a Big Ten lean. And then he feels like Virginia Tech is going to want to go to the SEC, but he doesn't think that the SEC will take them. So he felt much more confident in some of the other ones. If you're listening on podcasts, I'll read it off for you. He said Miami to the Big 12, Virginia to the Big 10, Clemson to the SEC, NC State to the Big 12, North Carolina to the SEC, Florida State to the Big 10, and then, like I said, Notre Dame to independent, which staying independent. I don't think there's really a switch there. And then Duke TBD, but he leans more SEC or staying in the ACC. And then same thing with Virginia Tech, leaning more toward the SEC, staying in the ACC. Zach, what were your thoughts on Brad Crawford's list here?
I mean, why would Miami go to the Sun Belt? I mean, seriously. No, that's actually not true. I just Miami fans chirp, and I just feel like I got to give it back. Until you win something, be quiet. Anyway, honestly, I didn't have too many qualms. I was surprised a little bit by UNC. Probably the biggest thing, and actually I'll shout out a good buddy of mine, Dan Hall, who is a Hokie fan through and through. I'm surprised just in the lack of desire for Virginia Tech. And I think, as I've thought about, I know they don't have AAU consideration or AAU accreditation.
That was the big thing for the Big Ten. They were playing.
Yeah, and I get that. And I know they've had a down few years. They are a big market. Like they are the big team in Virginia more than UVA. And I think that has really come to our attention through some of our other listeners who have shared. UVA's got the AAU. So I'm not surprised that UVA would go Big Ten, but it's surprising kind of maybe the lack of desire for Virginia Tech. And I'm curious if Brent Pry gets them back to where they were, back, in the more earlier Beamer days where they were,
right,
an ACC contender. I do wonder if their profile rises a bit. I was also surprised by Notre Dame. I know that Notre Dame is going to hold out to be independent as long as possible. But I think if the ACC collapses, I'm like, if you're going to have incentives for being a conference champion and you're going to get more money by being in the Big Ten or the SEC, I just don't understand why they would hold out. I don't get it.
I have thoughts on Notre Dame, but I think it's less about the conference championship and more about something else. But
yeah,
you finish.
Well, no, I think everything else makes sense. I think Miami, I could see Miami pairing with Florida State. We talked about this months ago.
Right.
But Miami doesn't have the fan support. And so I just don't know how them on their own doesn't make sense for the Big Ten or the SEC. Again, they would have to have a huge run here, I think, to raise their profile. NC State, I think, is in a similar boat. They don't have a great profile. So I think Big 12 makes more sense for those teams. So I think I don't have any huge qualms with it. I think I've come around on Virginia Tech a bit. And let's be honest, everybody's kind of throwing stuff and see what sticks. So I think they're decent projections, but
Well, it's interesting because we started with Florida State is going to lead the ACC, and it was okay, that was the big talking point. And then the big talking point after that is Notre Dame is leaving, independent / ACC and going somewhere. And then now we put out lists like this where it's the ACC is dying. Here's where everybody's going, and it's holy crap, how did we How do we move this fast? But I mean, it makes sense when you think about all the lawsuits and everything like that going on, and how much the ACC teams are losing and how much they want to continue to compete. I mean, you have Florida State last year, who should have been in the playoffs probably, and all that whole debacle happening, which I felt like was just the spike that just nailed everything down and said, yeah, Florida State's going to lead the ACC, and the ACC is going to fall apart if they can't actually get teams in the playoffs. Hooligan, your thoughts on this whole list? I've not actually talked to a Washington fan about conference expansion yet, so I'm very curious your thoughts and kind of what you all think out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is still certainly a lot of, it's a mixture of excitement, certainly to stay at the table and to stay, in the tier of college football where we felt we've always belonged. Yes, over the course of, the last 20 or so years, we had if you look at 2002 or about 2005 to 2015, that was a significant statistical aberration for what Washington has been historically. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of certain fan bases, without naming names, but they share a similar letter that like to say, oh, well, that's what Washington is, when that's not actually the case. I think that there's still a lot of sadness for what had been, at the time that the Pac-12 was formed. The Pac-12 actually had the best media deal of any conference in the country, and due to some significant malfeasance and lassitude and letting Larry Scott run rampant at as the conference commissioner for over a decade, the Conference of Champions died. And that's not just, because UCLA has 100 titles across all sports. It's, like, we've got some big time football programs out here. We've got some big time basketball programs out here. But in, Washington fans were certainly very happy to stay at the table. And certainly it's paired with, the past decade has been more of what honestly, it's even a little bit of a, kind of a rise back to pretty close to a high watermark for us. We've had 10 plus win seasons in the last 10 years. So we're excited about the opportunity. That team that I was mentioning, one of their fans sent something out this week about basically being a T-Rex coming to eat the Big Ten, and like, you didn't even win your own conference the last 2 years. So, but we're excited. I mean, I think it's, for me as a college football fan and not just a Washington fan, I think it's really sad to see a lot of the history of what has really made the sport great fall by the wayside, basically due to large media conglomerates that don't understand how to sell a great product and want to make it NFL light. And that's really unfortunate to me. And that, I'm glad that Washington will still continue to play Washington State. It's going to be at the beginning of the year and not at the end of the year like it used to be. I certainly think, having experienced one of the Washington-Oregon matchups, the one that was at Husky Stadium this past fall, having that in rivalry week at the end of the calendar is going to be a lot of fun going forward. But it is certainly with some reservation about what we're losing in the history of college football. Like, I'm absolutely excited to see, Michigan and Ohio State and any number of Big Ten programs on our schedule more regularly, and wish that had been the case, and that that it hadn't been across college football a significant benefit to just go semi-cupcake in the non-conference schedule, looking at USCC. But certainly I in looking at from a Washington perspective, looking at and to Crawford's projections, certainly going to Charlottesville would be a fun trip, and probably a more convenient one than some of the middle of non-populated areas, as is for the case for some of the Big Ten. It certainly, I would say, it's also interesting to see Florida State going to the Big, and him projecting North Carolina to the SEC, because that's definitely a flip of what you would think from an academic standpoint. And I would think that North Carolina would be a huge target for the Big Ten for sure.
Yeah, the North Carolina to SEC kind of shocked me in one sense because I feel like North Carolina fits better academically and things like that with the Big Ten. But then on the other side of that, what also kind of shocked me was Duke being to be decided. At least basketball wise, obviously in football, there's, no love lost there either, but at least basketball wise, I mean, this is one of the best rivalries in all of college athletics. And so, thankfully we've seen rivalries stay, but we've also seen rivalries go. Washington State, Oregon State, Oklahoma State with some of this stuff. And so I'm thankful for the rivalries that we keep, but at the end of the day, I also look forward to seeing actual matchups throughout the year. I one of the things that always bothered me the most is that, how much people talk about like, oh, you didn't play anybody this, you didn't play anybody that. And it's like, well, you play the schedule that's put in front of you. And sometimes you put a team on the out of conference schedule and it's really good. And sometimes you put them on there and it's really not, Ohio State, how long ago was it, Hooligan, when we played Washington in the out of conference? I mean, if that game happens, what was it, 18, 19 or something like that? Maybe
it's been a while. You guys had Oregon, and then, but I think our last series with you guys was maybe that was kind of in the middle of that period that was a statistical outlier for Washington, and we were not particularly good.
It would have been before that, yeah.
It was 2007, right? 2003, 2007.
Yeah. So you got two games against Tyrone Willingham or Keith Gilbertson, who were not exactly shining members of the Husky Hall of Fame. Right. Gilbertson is definitely on a different tier above Tyrone Willingham and Washington lore, given that Keith Gilbertson was the offensive coordinator for our 1991 national championship team. But it's been a minute, and so that's certainly a series, and I think there had been actually a series scheduled, and then with the conference move, I think that kind of went off the books. We had a series scheduled with Wisconsin that Wisconsin backed out of prior to the realignment announcement. The other one that comes to mind is that, like, we got, at the tail end of the Peterson era, and UW fans are not big fans of Quint Kessenich because he put 3 cupcakes out in terms of regarding Washington's schedule, because we played Rutgers. And yes, there were a couple of cupcakes, but when we had scheduled Rutgers had been 7, 8, and 9 wins for 3 or 4 seasons in a row, and then fell off a cliff. And, with college football scheduling, when that's happening 3 and 4 years advance for a non-conference schedule, Washington has a series scheduled with Tennessee in 2029 and 2030. You don't have any control about what that program is going to be that far down the line. Certainly, I'm hopeful that Tennessee is at or near where they are currently. Certainly, I'm hopeful that Washington is at or near where we've been recently. But you can never guarantee that by any stretch of anybody's imagination. So,
right. And that's what killed college football scheduling, was having to schedule 7, 8 years out sometimes. I mean, Ohio State has games on the books right now for like 2032, 2034, stuff like that. It's like, we should not be scheduling that far out. We have no idea what this team is going to look like at this point in time. So, and
meanwhile, the SEC is scheduling, the Citadel and
they only play 8 conference games. Wimps. All right, let's get to some comments here. Jared Jones says, hello all. Hello, Jared. Thank you for being here. Dave says, not putting Florida State in the college football playoff killed the ACC. I agree. That is one of the things that hurt it the most. And then Heel Brothers, our College Huddle North Carolina podcast, they say they want to go to the SEC. Very interesting. So you guys like this list, then, I assume. And then the United Ones, this is our UCF podcast. They, for College Huddle, they said, saw a rival network's video on asking Big 12 teams to have $22 million per school for player payroll. How does this impact this? A lot of schools will find it tough to continue to compete. Yes, United Ones, this is what I was going to bring up with the he's got a few other comments here. I'll read these real fast. Give me Miami for sure. Number 4 in the Big 4. We will help their attendant woes in state rivalries. Hopefully locked in. There you go. UCF is scheduled through 2031. There you go. Yep. No, so
I like that United Ones podcast. Well done. Well done.
They're a primo podcast. We had them on the College Huddle G5 playoff show, and Roger did a really good job. So this is why I think Notre Dame does not stay independent. you're going to have this conference revenue in order to pay what it's looking like $20 to $22 million in revenue sharing to the players. I mean, yes, Notre Dame makes very good money from NBC. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that they don't make money. Obviously, they would not be an independent if they were not making money to be able to do those things. But to me, that's the biggest thing that impacts this for Notre Dame is, yes, the conference championship thing, whatever they say it doesn't matter. I think it does, but they love their tradition and that's great. I think that tradition is great in college football. But at the end of the day, if we start putting out a $22 to $20 million payroll for these players, you're going to have to get some of this money from the conferences, especially a conference like the Big Ten, who's making as much money as they are for their members. And let's be honest, guys, the Big Ten is not just going to continue to willy-nilly add teams. We're at 18 teams right now with Oregon and Washington coming in addition to USC and UCLA. I mean, the Big Ten teams are not going to be making nearly as much if it's 24 teams. And so I think at the end of the day, if Notre Dame wants to get in, it's either get in now or you're going to get left behind, and Notre Dame is going to have to rely on this NBC contract where they're getting, 1:00 games with, I forget who the announcer is that they kept getting last year. Boy, he was awful. I forget what his name was. He was the son of another guy, but
it's Ian Eagle's son.
Is it Ian Eagle's son?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, they're just not giving them a very good product in my mind. I mean, NBC, yeah, they're paying them well, but yeah. So at the end of the day, that's the thing that I look at the most is that, like, Notre Dame, if they are going to have to start paying their players with this revenue sharing, they're going to have to look at going to either the Big Ten or the SEC. And I don't think the SEC wants them. I think they're Big Ten only in my mind. Zach, your thoughts?
Well, and I think that's just it. Notre Dame, for as long as they've been as big as they are, they haven't needed anything. Like, they haven't needed revenue sharing because they've had such a great contract. That's changing. And if you don't have the money, and I hate saying this because I think this goes to your point, Hooligan, about what made the sport great is now going the wayside. But like, if you don't have multiple revenue streams to be able to pay players, you're going to get left in the dust. And Notre Dame is not going to be able to have the same type of contract as the Big Ten or the SEC. And so for them to stay independent is to get left behind.
And by no means, I do want to be clear that by no means am I saying that paying the players is a step that shouldn't have been taken. It absolutely
yeah.
And I'm just saying that it's the other things that I think we could have lived in a world where the players were paid and compensated appropriately, where you didn't have to run roughshod over so much of the history of college football. With that said, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the other thing, like, that's, you talk about the Big Ten and, the Big Ten teams getting less of a share of, as the conference continues to expand. Obviously this is still an ever-changing landscape. Mm-hmm. There's absolutely going to be a world in which probably the top 32 or maybe the top 34 or top 32, top 48, maybe top 6, biggest 64 programs in the country consolidate. And I think that's going to mean programs at the bottom of even the big conferences like the SEC and the Big Ten are going to fall by the wayside. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see at some juncture a tier of college football between what is now FBS and what is now FCS, where it's maybe the lower end of the revenue producing programs, even from from what was the Power Five, and the top revenue producing programs from the G5. Some are going to rise up, some are going to fall off, where there is going to be that G5 playoff. I think that's spot on. I think that's definitely the direction, because there's, despite all of the consolidation and conglomeration of just the media companies themselves, there's going to be inventory, and it's still a sport that people want to watch, and people are still going to want to support their teams in whatever way they can. There's just going to be the big boys, the big boys, the medium size.
Yeah, we talked about it in the G5 playoff show, and I think it was really a really good point. Like, at some point, we're going to see an NIL type of playoff or something like that, like what we have in basketball, but we're going to see it for football. And maybe it'll be called the G5 playoff. Maybe it'll be half G5, half, power 2, power 4, whatever it is. But at some point, we're going to see, I mean, there's too much money, and the Bulls don't make enough. I'm not going to say they don't make enough money, but they're having too many players opt out. And so they're going to try to figure out some kind of way to make these players actually want to compete. And whether that's a G5 playoff, a power 4, NIT or something like that, something like that is going to have to happen. I just checked the numbers and it says Google tells me, so I'm just going off Google here. Notre Dame makes $50 million from NBC, which is just slightly less than what SEC teams are making right now. The Big Ten teams are making at least $80 million a year. So, I mean, like, is Independence worth $30 million less?
No, well, yeah. If they join the conference, that could actually sweeten the media deal again for the Big Ten.
Yep.
One note, and this is just fact checking myself. Dan Hicks and Jason Garrett were the primary crew on Notre Dame games. NBC football, Big Ten football, it was Noah Eagle and Todd Blackledge.
Okay.
So and I love Todd Blackledge. He's awesome.
The son. I know there's a son that does Notre Dame games.
Noah Eagle has filled in. And he is Ian Eagle's son, but he is not the primary guy. It's Dan Hicks and Jason Garrett.
It must be Hicks I don't like then, because there's somebody that does the Notre Dame games that I don't like. And it's not Eagle, because I remember watching the Michigan State Michigan game and some of the other ones where I'm like, oh, these announcers are pretty good. So whoever it is, I don't know. I'll have to figure out who I dislike when the season starts. We'll see.
And this might be jumping the CFB media thing. Todd Blackledge, I think, is one of the most underrated color guys in the business.
There it is. Thank you, Bootzilla. Collinsworth. His son. He stinks. Can't stand him. I can't remember what his first name is.
Wait.
Stinks.
We don't like a Collinsworth?
No, I like
really?
No.
Yeah.
He pumps up Patrick Mahomes, and it's kind of funny whenever we listen to a game when he does that. So I find entertainment from that. But his son, oh my gosh, I can't. Not for me. But